Hey everybody. This is a chapter from Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, the Third Period, 1930 to 1941, Part 1, The Dominated. This chapter is from Part 3 of the book. Part 3 of the book is titled Mass Terror and Forced Labor, and Chapter 1 of this Part 3 is titled Mass Repression and Terror. And that's what we'll be reading today in this video. So here we go. Mass terror and forced labor. The brutal expropriation of the peasantry, the accelerated rural exodus, and the anti-worker offensives of the 1930s were accompanied both as cause and effect by a mass repression and a terror which allowed the development of capitalist forms of work and exploitation sui generis. Repression and terror of the 1930s were linked to the completion of the capitalist revolution from above, which began at the end of the 1920s. At that time, it was above all workers and peasants who were affected, but militants of other origins were also stricken when they were accused of being hostile to a policy that was presented as being the, quote, building of socialism, end quote. On the other hand, at the end of 1934, this same capitalist revolution embarked on a terror that was more, quote, individualized and, quote, inquisitorial, end quote, than that which had preceded it. It systematically had recourse to other methods, parenthesis, long interrogations and tortures, end parenthesis, and aimed at other, quote, social targets, end quote. Among the latter figured a large number of party members, economic and administrative cadres, scientific workers, etc. The terror in the main struck not the, quote, guilty ones, end quote. At first, it affected men sent without trial to deportation or death, or it struck, quote, accused, end quote, who might be the object of a, quote, trial, end quote, that could be apparently meticulous, but who were then sentenced even if they had not clearly committed the acts of which they were accused. These were the, quote, criminals without crimes, end quote. We shall see in Volume 4 of the present work that the transition to, quote, individualized, end quote, and inquisitorial terror was mainly connected with social struggles, ideological and political, within the leading or privileged strata, whose belonging to these strata were thereby placed in a situation of enormous dependence on the goodwill of the party leadership. Through mass repression and terror, there was achieved a social and political transformation which virtually gave birth to a capitalism of a new type, which basically conformed with the ideas of the party leadership. All right, so here's the actual chapter. That was the introduction to Part 3 of the book. Now we're at the chapter, Mass Repression and Terror. Since the first years of its existence, Bolshevik power had not hesitated to have recourse to brutal forms of repression and terror, especially against workers or peasants who resisted Bolshevik power, either for economic reasons, parenthesis, for example, the peasants shot during the Civil War because they tried to evade food requisitions which would have left them with nothing to eat, end parenthesis, or for political reasons, parenthesis, like the workers and sailors of Kronstadt who in 1921 demanded a return to the genuine power of the Soviets, end parenthesis. Now, this is interesting because I'm not exactly sure. There's 4 volumes of this work, Class Struggles in the USSR by Charles Bettelheim. And one of the things that is only this volume's available on Libcom. And I think and they were written in chronological order. I'm not sure, so I might be talking about my butt. But I think in the first volume of this book, he says a lot of like Stalinist and indeed Trotskyist myths about Kronstadt. About it either being a white plot or being objectively counter-revolutionary, whatever its intentions may have been. Anyway, following 1917 and at the beginning of the 1920s, repression and terror also struck, of course, members of the old dominant classes and equally the specialists or administrators who were working for the new authorities, if their activity did not develop in the way the leaders wished. Thus, in September 1921, Lenin demanded that officials working for the authorities should suffer, quote, strict punishment, end quote, for their, quote, red tape, end quote, and that their trials should be regarded as a, quote, political affair, end quote. Instructions to this effect were given to the courts. For most of the 1920s, mass repression and terror were in decline. They resumed from 1928 to 1929 with the recourse to grain requisitions and then collectivization from above. New section, Section 1, the upsurge of mass repression and terror. Mass repression and terror began at the end of the 1920s. Mass repression and terror were engendered above all by the anti-peasant struggle, but also extended to the working class. Heading A, the Anti-Peasant War. The historical starting point for the mass repression and terror was the anti-peasant war at the end of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s. This anti-peasant war resulted from the rupture of the compromise that the NEP had established between the peasant revolution and the capitalist revolution, a rupture which henceforth would be pushed to the very end. In our popular discourse, or not, why did I say popular discourse? That's a weird thing to say. Why did I say popular discourse? It's weird. No, in Russia, this is known as the smichka. Although maybe he's not using the word smichka here because he's referring to it as the compromise between the peasant revolution and the capitalist revolution is how he's using the word here. Usually the smichka is referring to like the peasant revolution and the workers' revolution. So maybe that's why he's not using the word smichka. And I think that's fair. Anyway, this war resulted from the rupture of the compromise that the NEP had established between the peasant revolution and the capitalist revolution, a rupture which henceforth would be pushed to the very end. This rupture, if we look at it schematically, was accomplished in the name of, quote, the anti-kulak struggle, end quote, and of the, quote, building of socialism, end quote. It resulted in the expropriation of the peasantry, the destruction of the peasant civilization, and of the experience contained in the latter. It led to the development of social relationships which slipped the rural workers into a new division of labor and subjected them to new forms of domination and exploitation. These upheavals encountered enormous resistance put up by the peasants, who refused to integrate themselves actively into the new social relationships that the authorities imposed on them. It was this resistance that brought forth mass repression and terror. Deportation struck millions of kulaks and alleged kulaks, while millions of peasants died from a famine that was largely, quote, fabricated, end quote, in order to, quote, punish, end quote, their resistance. Parenthesis, the authorities refused to draw on grain stocks and let those peasants die who would not conform with their instructions, end parenthesis. That's interesting. This anti-peasant war developed in two great waves. For the first wave of repression, there is an official estimate of the number of peasants deported. According to this estimate, deportations at that time struck 240,757 families, parenthesis, representing about 1.2 million people, end parenthesis. It was stated that the majority of these deportees were not put in camps, but were exiled in underpopulated regions of the North Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Urals. Those who were of working age were attached to the timber industry, to the mines, or to other industrial enterprises. Some were on state farms. Others were authorized to form kolkhozes in the region to which they had immigrated. In fact, some of the deportees were interned in work camps, but how many is not known. However, it is known that the deportation took place in the worst possible conditions, entailing numerous deaths, mainly among young children and old people. The second wave, parenthesis, 1932 to 34, end parenthesis, of anti-peasant repression and terror was not marked in any published official estimate, it seems. Peasants were then deported for the most varied reasons. Many of those who continued to be described as, quote, kulaks or, quote, pro-kulaks were among them, but others were accused of, quote, sabotaging, end quote, the work of the kolkhozes, of embezzlement or the theft of property belonging to the kolkhozes. Most often it was a question of gatherers or gleaners of grain who acted as they did simply to ensure their own and their family's survival. I think these laws were called the spikelets laws. Wikipedia says the law of the spikelets, or law of three spikelets, was a decree in the Soviet Union to protect state property of coal causes (Soviet collective farms), especially the grain they produced, from theft, largely by desperate peasants during the Soviet famine of 1932 to 33. The law of spikelets decree was also known as the quote quote 7/8 law, end quote, because of the date in Russian is filled in forms as 7/8/1932, 7th of August 1932. The law provided a severe punishment for stolen collective and cooperative property, quote, execution with confiscation of all property and replacement in mitigating circumstances with imprisonment for at least 10 years with confiscation of all property, end quote. Amnesty was prohibited in these cases. Although the formal name of the law was longer, the common names Law of Spikelets and Law of Three Spikelets came into use because of the article and brochure of Prosecutor General A. Vyshinsky, where he condemned the practice to prosecute both corrupt officials and those who glean the grains, or spikelets, left behind in the fields after the entire harvest was officially collected and counted. The decree was accepted and harshly, sometimes overly harshly used, during the Soviet famine of 1932 to 33. In 1936, the cases of the application of the law were reconsidered, and over 60% of the convicted were released. 1936, 118,360 inmates. 1937, 44,409 inmates. End parenthesis. Back to the text. During these years, repression extended also through the progressive, quote, penalization, end quote, of labor legislation, and by virtue of an increasingly extensive application of Article 58 of the Criminal Code of the USSR, which allowed anyone to be sentenced who had committed an act intended to, quote, weaken, end quote, the standing of the authorities, and the police and the courts could include in this type of act the non-fulfillment of a work norm or more often of a task that had to be fulfilled. This widening of the application of Article 58 also permitted the sentencing of those who had made critical remarks considered to be, quote, anti-Soviet or, quote, counter-revolutionary, end quote. Failure to denounce the authors of such acts was also regarded as a, quote, act which weakened there's some typo here, as a, quote, act which weakened the standing of the authorities, I think that's what it means to say, end quote, and was therefore actionable, which explains why the parents and friends of those sentenced were also sentenced in their turn. These latter forms of repression, which struck not only the peasants, developed well beyond the years of 1932 to 34, that is, when repression was transformed into mass terror whose main target was no longer the peasantry. However, before this transformation came into force, attempts had been made by the party leadership to put a brake on the, quote, excesses, end quote, of the anti-peasant repression because of the negative economic effects this was causing. At the beginning of 1933, the wave of arrests and deportations became so large that it had a bad effect on production and even disturbed railway operations, the deportees being transported by train. At this juncture, the party leadership made a momentary effort to put a brake on repressive measures, as is testified by a secret letter sent to the cadres of the main Soviet organs by Stalin and Molotov. In this letter, dated May 8, 1933, it was said in particular that, quote, the Central Committee and Sovnarkom have been informed that in the countryside massive and thoughtless arrests still in part characterize the behavior of our officials. Such arrests are made by village Soviet chairmen, secretaries of party cells, and responsible officials of the Krais and Rions. These arrests are made by anyone who feels like it, and they have absolutely no right to do so. It is not surprising that with the orgy of arrests, the judiciary organs which have the real right to conduct them, including those of the OGPU and especially of the militia, are losing all sense of proportion and are propagating abuse of arrests on the principle, quote, first arrest, then investigate, end quote, end quote. The letter indicates that of the 800,000 detained in penitential institutions, parenthesis, a figure which includes neither camps nor labor colonies, end parenthesis, 400,000 were to be freed within 2 months, and the others were to be transferred to camps and labor colonies. The courts and the procuracies were entrusted with checking the activity of the organizations of repression. For several months, this circular had a certain effect, but at the end of 1934, after the assassination of Kirov, mass arrests reappeared on an even larger scale than in 1933. At the same time, the anti-peasant war, then the anti-worker struggle, and the development of terror quickly swelled the apparatus of repression, and gave the apparatus of repression political weight and unprecedented possibilities of action. B. The anti-worker offensive. Although it is impossible to, quote, measure, end quote, their dimensions, the anti-worker repression and terror were apparently not on such a large scale as those that struck the peasants. In addition, it took other forms because the priority according to industrialization did not allow the factories to be deprived of too large a proportion of their workers. Nevertheless, it would be quite false to think that the workers were not touched by the repression. On the one hand, the testimony of those who were held in the camps, who came out of them and were able to make known what life was like in them at different times, reveals that a large number of workers were in the camps. Footnote: among these testimonies covering various periods are the following: Anton Siliga, The Russian Enigma, in several editions, not always identical, in both French and English. M.B. Neumann, Deporté en Siberie, I don't know. E.S. Ginsberg, Into the Whirlwind, published in 1967. Les Cils de la Colima, published in 1980. V. Shalamov, Récit de la Colima, published in Paris in 1981-82. Victor Serge, Memoirs of a Revolutionary, 1901 to 1941. M. Zalkman, La vie des mouches, ouvriers, juifs et communistes sous Staline, published in 1978. L. Kopelev, Conservateur pour l'éternité. Solzhenitsyn, The Gulag Archipelago. E. Guarnaschelli, Une petite pierre, published in 1979, end footnote. On the other hand, it is known that during the 1930s, many factories were managed by the NKVD, and that the workers who worked in them were those who had been sentenced. Footnote: see, for example, the secret version of the Economic Plan of 1941. Finally, the working class was hit throughout the 1930s by various repressive prescriptions, quote, general prescriptions like Article 58 of the Criminal Code, which allowed many workers to be sentenced for non-fulfillment of norms or for, quote, anti-Soviet talk, end quote, parenthesis, the slightest criticism could be described as such, end parenthesis, and penal prescriptions of the, quote, labor legislation, end quote. Repression and anti-worker terror made it possible to subject the industrial workers to a discipline that was increasingly brutal, and to make them, quote, accept, end quote, a serious decline of their working and living conditions. The threat of arrest or deportation or work in the camps subjected industrial, transport, mining, and construction workers to the increasing demands of factory despotism, which itself was pushed to an extreme point by the economic policy of the party and by the requirements of obedience and attention to work which it imposed. This threat fulfilled the same function as that which in the development of, quote, Western, end quote, capitalism, parenthesis, especially in England, Germany, and France, end parenthesis, had been fulfilled by, quote, workhouses, end quote, houses of terror, end quote, houses of correction and other forms of forced labor and of farming out the poor. Footnote: for the forms of work, see Marx's Capital, and also Maurice Dobbs' book Studies in the Development of Capitalism. End footnote. The disciplinary function which repression carried out in regard to the working class during the 1930s in the USSR was, however, deeper than that which at the beginning of, quote, Western, end quote, capitalism was carried out by the, quote, house of terror, quote, houses, plural, of terror, end quote, because it was a matter of getting accepted at the same time both a factory despotism and an especially severe political despotism. Where am I? Press the button. Also, the scale of repression and terror in the 1930s was without precedent. The repression had a profound, quote, disciplinarian, quote, effect in terms of daily attitudes. In fact, part of the Zeki, parenthesis, see list of abbreviations on page 15, in parenthesis, instead of being separated from, quote, free, end quote, workers, were placed beside them, so the latter could see the miserable conditions in which those who had been sentenced found themselves. Wikipedia says Zek is a term for inmates in the Soviet Union and modern Russia originating in the gulags. Back to the text. The effect of terror thus imposed on the workers a discipline that was not only economic but also political. The disciplinary fear of criticizing the existing order. Numerous testimonies indicate that the presence of detainees by the side of free workers was very frequent. Some of these testimonies come from Soviet citizens who fled abroad, and others from foreigners who worked in the USSR. For example, John Scott, an American who worked at the Magnitogorsk construction site in the mid-1930s, said that about 30% of the workers at this site were attached to various forms of penal labor. Usually they were allotted to the hardest kind of work. 2 footnotes. Among the first eyewitnesses in the immediate post-war period, V.A. Kravchenko and his book I Chose Freedom, published in 1946, should be mentioned. And footnote. Footnote. These facts have been proved by John Scott in January 1938 for the Secretariat. These facts have been provided by John Scott in January 1938 for the Secretariat of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. They occur in a recently published report of that period. See on this point the article by S.G. Wheatcroft titled On Assessing the Size of Forced Concentration Camp Labor in the Soviet Union, 1929 to 1956, published in Soviet Studies, 1981. This, moreover, is only confirmation of things known from numerous other sources. End footnote. These various aspects of the mass repression and terror represent the most extreme forms of the struggle of the dominant to subjugate, oppress, and exploit to a maximum the dominated classes. They did have their equivalent in the capitalist centers and even more in countries under colonialism or imperialism. They can still be found today in a certain number of American and Southern African countries. The development of individualized and inquisitorial terror, which took shape on a large scale from 1935, constitutes, on the contrary, a particular phenomenon connected with the specific form of capitalism which at that time was born in the Soviet Union. New section, section 2. The quote, individualized, end quote, inquisitorial terror of 1935 to 1938. The late 1920s and early 1930s were marked by the first rebirth of individualized and inquisitorial terror. This began in 1928 with the trial of non-communist engineers and technicians at Shakti, and continued through several other show trials, like those organized against the alleged, quote, industrial party, end quote, or against the, quote, peasant party, end quote. But these were only, quote, preliminaries, end quote, which did not directly involve members of the party. The years 1932 and 1933 and most of 1934 were often characterized by a relaxation of mass repression and of the different forms of terror. But suddenly, from December 1st, 1934, following the assassination of Kirov, party secretary at Leningrad, the country entered a period of terror whose development was an initiative of the party leadership. From the second half of 1936 and up to the end of 1938, this terror, mainly individualized and inquisitorial, took an exacerbated form. Footnote. In the sense that it gave rise to formerly painstaking police inquiries, to the compiling of police reports, quote, to be preserved for eternity, end quote, according to the official formula, and on every possible occasion, public trials that were real instructional shows taken to the extreme limit. End footnote. From 1939 to the death of Stalin in 1953, it became more, quote, routine, end quote, without becoming less extensive or less brutal, end especially as it combined with new developments in repression, end But there were new explosions after the war. Some of the occurrences which inaugurated the terror of 1935 to 38, as well as some of their most spectacular manifestations, should be mentioned. On December 1st, 1934, in the afternoon, Kirov was assassinated by a young communist, quickly accused of having acted under the influence of the ideas of old party leaders who had been removed from power since the late 1970s, Zinoviev and Kamenev. In reality, the very way in which this event took place, as well as its aftermath, make it almost certain that the assassination was organized by Stalin with the help of the NKVD. Footnote. Not end footnote. In the book by Robert Conquest, The Great Terror, one chapter is devoted to the detailed account of the murder of Kirov, and this includes the various arguments tending to prove that this assassination was initiated by Stalin and carried out with the help of certain NKVD agents. The comments of Khrushchev and other participants of the 22nd Party Congress in 1961 provide many signs pointing in the same direction, but without drawing definite conclusions. See the report of this Congress, the speeches of Khrushchev and Z.T. Serdyuk in Cahiers du Communisme, it's like Communism Notebooks, special number, December 1961, end footnote. The speed with which the mechanism of terror was unloosed amply confirms this. In addition to details about the circumstances of the assassination, one of the most striking facts is the signature, on the same day as the assassination, of a decree which organized the, quote, judicial procedure, end quote, of the terror. In addition to details about the circumstances of the assassination, one of the most striking facts is the signature, on the same day as the assassination, of a decree which organized the, quote, judicial procedure, end quote, of the terror. This decree was certainly prepared in advance. Another noteworthy detail is in that the decree was signed by the state authorities without the Politburo having been told, which was contrary to all the rules about the preeminence of the party over the state. Footnote, see the, quote, secret report, end quote, of Khrushchev to the 20th Party Congress, published in English in various publications, including T.H. Rigby's The Stalin Dictatorship, published in 1968. It was only on the following day that the Politburo, faced with this fait accompli, quote, ratified, end quote, the decree. The decree radically modified judicial procedure. It ordered investigatory organizations to carry out death sentences announced for this category of crimes immediately without awaiting possible pardons from the Presidium of the Central Executive Committee. The organs of the NKVD, parenthesis, that is, the police, in parenthesis, also received the order to execute without delay those sentenced to death. The decree was published on December 2nd, and on December 10th, the Criminal Procedure Code was modified. Extrajudicial organs were installed within the NKVD, and these could pronounce sentences, parenthesis, death or deportation, in parenthesis, without investigation or trial. On December 4th, there was published a long list of, quote, white guards, end quote, arrested and condemned to death in Moscow and Leningrad. Similar sentences were pronounced in various regions of the Soviet Union, especially in the Ukraine. However, some days later, the real targets of the terror unleashed by the authorities appeared. These targets were first the oppositionists or former oppositionists who are members or ex-members of the party, then all those labeled as oppositionists, quote, saboteurs or, quote, spies, end quote. Before mid-December, the Central Committee, parenthesis, in fact the General Secretary, end parenthesis, sent a secret letter to all party committees requiring the denunciation, expulsion, and arrest of all oppositionists who were still party members. This initial initiative launched a series of denunciations and a press campaign against the, quote, Trotskyist and, quote, Zinovievites, end quote. At Leningrad alone, tens of thousands of people were deported following this campaign. People who had recently met Kamenev or Zinoviev were accused of, quote, plotting, end quote. On December 16th, a resolution of the Leningrad Party Committee denounced the anti-party group of former Zinovievites as being responsible for the assassination. On December 17th, the Moscow Committee voted on a similar resolution, parenthesis, Pravda, December 17th, 1934, in parenthesis. On the 22nd of December, Pravda published a list of arrested, quote, Zinovievites, on which were included Zinoviev and Kamenev, former members of the Politburo. A case was prepared against them for their, quote, political responsibility, end quote, in the assassination. However, the political situation was still not quite right for a severe sentence against these two party leaders. Finally, on January 16, 1935, they were sentenced respectively to 10 and to 5 years in prison, after which Zinoviev apparently made a, quote, self-criticism, end quote, in which Zinoviev declared that the past activity of the opposition had impelled certain people to criminal acts due to, quote, objective circumstances, end quote. In the following months, arrests and deportations made by simple decision of the NKVD proliferated. During this period, entire trains of deportees left from the different regions of the Soviet Union to fill the prisons and the camps. The public spoke of these trains as being the, quote, trains of Kirov's assassins, end quote. The same term, quote, Kirov's assassins, end quote, was used in the camps to describe these new waves of deportees. Henceforth, the still existing statute for political prisoners was suppressed, everyone being subject to a harsh regime. Thus, the assassination of Kirov was the starting point for a wave of repression whose scale increased from 1935 to 1938 with the most typical manifestations of individualized and inquisitorial terror occurring between 1936 and 1938. One of these manifestations were the so-called, quote, show trials, end quote, in Moscow, but there were others. These trials simultaneously prepared, parenthesis, up to a certain point, in parenthesis, and obscured the massive scale of the terror and its real significance. We shall return to this in Volume 4 of the present work, when we shall examine the social, political, and ideological contradictions which contributed to development of state terror. New section, Section A, the three Moscow, quote, great trials, end quote. In chronological order, these three trials were the trial which began on August 19, 1936, called the, quote, Trial of the 16, end quote, after the number of accused. The two main accused being Zinoviev and Kamenev, the trial which began on the 23rd of January 1937, where there were 18 accused, but often called the, quote, Pyatakov trial, unquote. The trial which began on March 2nd, 1938, and frequently described as the, quote, Bukharin trial, unquote, because Bukharin was the principal accused, although at Bukharin's side appeared also Rykov, Yagoda, former chief of the NKVD and the organizer of the two preceding trials, and Krestinsky, and several other old Bolsheviks. These trials took place in public and were presented with real, quote, stage management, end quote. Reading the transcript of these trials, it would seem that, in effect, not only the prosecutors and, quote, judges, end quote, were playing a role which had been assigned to them, but the accused were also doing the same thing. Reading the transcript of these trials, it would seem that, in effect, not only the prosecutors and, quote, judges, end quote, were playing a role which had been assigned to them, but the accused were also doing the same thing. Footnote. These reports have been published as follows. Report of court proceedings, the case of the Trotskyite Zinovievite Terrorist Center, published in Moscow in 1936, referred to as, quote, Zinoviev case, end quote, in following notes. Report of court proceedings in the case of the anti-Soviet Trotskyite Center, Moscow 1937, in parentheses, referred to as, quote, Pyatakov case, end quote. In notes of this book, reports of the court proceedings in the case of the anti-Soviet, quote, block of rights and Trotskyites, end quote. Moscow 1938. The, quote, Bukharin case, end quote, for the purpose of notes for this part of the book. Also see in particular Robert Conquest, The Great Terror, and also the article The Great Terror Revised, published in Survey number 78, 1978-1. See R. Medvedev, Let History Judge, Chapter 6. As well, there are P. Bruet, Les Procès de Moscou, 1930, published in 1965 in Paris. A. Kriegel, Les Grands Procès dans le système communiste, and Kair non Trotsky, July to September 1979. And footnote. In the course of years, eyewitness testimony and proof have accumulated to confirm the falsity and the fabricated nature of the accusations, and to show these, quote, great trials, end quote, as well as thousands of others taking place in the same way, followed a, quote, scenario, end quote, prepared in advance down to the smallest details. The same procedures were sent into operation between 1948 and 1954 in the countries of the Soviet bloc. For Czechoslovakia, there is a dossier which illuminates especially well the method of fabrication in such cases. C.K. Kaplan, Procès politique à Prague, published in Brussels, 1980. The author, in fact, had access to the archives of the Czech Communist Party, to archives to the political trials and other archives. The documents show the role played by Soviet advisors in several cases. These advisors helping to reproduce the Moscow trials, quote, model. End footnote. The accused admitted practically all the, quote, crimes, end quote, which the authorities required them to confess. If one or another of them strayed a little from his role or momentarily hesitated to accuse himself, the intervention of the prosecution visibly brought him to order. If these interventions were not enough, quote, suspensions of the session, end quote, were ordered, following which the accused rediscovered the, quote, path of confession, end quote, since then it had been learned that the confessions were extracted by all possible means, including torture, to which both the accused and those people close to the accused were subjected. These trials served as the prototypes for thousands of others, which took place all over the Soviet Union, and resulted in death sentences, prison sentences, or deportation. They served as, quote, demonstrations of the all-powerfulness, end quote, of the police, and to orchestrate great ideological campaigns aimed at proving the criminal nature of all opposition, real or assumed. Without recourse to the proofs that later became available of the fabricated nature of these great trials, a careful analysis of the official transcripts reveals the inconsistent, contradictory, and implausible nature of the basic accusations, as well as the, quote, confessions, end quote, which were used to, quote, confirm, end quote, the truthfulness of the accusations. Putting the known facts in the, quote, confessions, end quote, side by side clearly shows the absurdity of almost everything that was, quote, confessed, end quote. Two footnotes. Footnote. In one of the statements that he made before the judges, Bukharin succeeded in emphasizing the only, quote, proofs of the, quote, truthfulness, end quote, of the accusations were the confessions coming from people who themselves had declared that they had lied all their lives. In one of the statements that Bukharin made before the judges, Bukharin succeeded in emphasizing the only, quote, proofs of the, quote, truthfulness of the accusations were the confessions coming from people who themselves had declared that they had lied all their lives. Bukharin also recalled that since the Middle Ages, no court had relied totally on confessions of the accused. For Vyshinsky, then public prosecutor, confession was, on the contrary, the supreme proof, end quote. Not end quote, exclamation point. End footnote. Footnote. For example, Zinoviev and Kamenev, quote, confessed, end quote, that having directed a, quote, terrorist center, end quote, from 1932 to 1936. However, since 1932, they had been under strict surveillance, being at first deported and then put in prison in December 1934. Similarly, in the second trial, Pyatakov stated that Pyatakov had flown to Oslo in December 1934 and had there met with Trotsky to prepare an agreement with Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, a plot and various sabotage plans. However, on the named date, an aircraft had landed at Oslo, and the Hotel Bristol, mentioned in Pyatakov's, quote, confession. However, on the named date, no aircraft had landed at Oslo, and the Hotel Bristol, mentioned in Pyatakov's, quote, confession, had ceased to exist long before December 1934. One can make a long list of such, quote, confessions that were in opposition to facts. See also the, quote, counter-trial, end quote, of the Dewitt Commission, which appeared under the title Not Guilty, the Case of Leon Trotsky, 1937. On this subject, one of the most detailed and recent studies is T.R. Poole's, quote, counter-trial, Leon Trotsky on the Soviet Purge Trials, a thesis published at University of Massachusetts in 1974. One can also find copious documentation and references to the special number of Kier Leon Trotsky, the Leon Trotsky notebooks, July to September 1979, titled Le Procès de Moscou. I don't know if it's say Moscow. I don't know how you say it in French. End footnote. New section. Section B. The liquidation of the Army officers and the High Command. Although it did not take the form of a show trial, the liquidation of the Army High Command and the main military cadres cannot be separated from the, quote, great trials, end quote. In fact, those who were stricken in this liquidation were, like the Moscow accused, party members of long standing, and they had passed the test of fire. The trials of these military leaders developed from the spring of 1937. They took place, quote, discreetly and rapidly. Footnote. The first signs of an attack to come against the army leaders appeared at the beginning of 1937. In January, the names of two of these leaders were mentioned at the Pyatakov trial. At the February-March plenum, Stalin alluded to the threats that could weigh on the country should there be spies among the Army High Command. On May 10, 1937, the system of Army political commissars was reintroduced. See Leonard Shapiro, The Communist Party of the Soviet Union, published 1970. End footnote. The trials took place, quote, discreetly, end quote, and rapidly. On May 11, 1937, the Chief of Staff of the Far East Army Corps, Lapin, was arrested. Lapin would, quote, commit suicide, end quote, in his prison cell. On the 31st of May, 1937, Gamarnik, head of the Army's political directorate, and who had always been devoted to Stalin, likewise, quote, committed suicide, end quote. On June 11th, there was the arrest, the sentence, parenthesis, in closed court, end parenthesis, and the execution of nearly all the high command, Tukhachevsky, Yakir, Uborovich, and many others. The, quote, purge, end quote, of the army continued up to 1938. Among those who were dismissed, arrested, and sentenced were 7 deputy commissars of defense, 3 out of the 5 marshals, 13 out of the 15 commanders of military districts, 3 out of 4 army commanders of first rank, all 12 army commanders of second rank, 60 of the 67 corps commanders, 136 of the 199 division commanders, and from 15,000 to 20,000 officers. On an equally massive scale, political commissars and naval officers were also stricken. Footnote. See Pierre Bruet, La Partie Bolchevique, Robert Conquest, The Great Terror, R. Medvedev, History Judge, L. Shapiro, The Communist Party, and the books by the Soviet historian A. Nekrich and P. Grigorenko. End footnote. Officially, the military leaders who were arrested and executed were accused of having prepared a, quote, coup d'etat, end quote. That would have included the occupation of the Kremlin by the army officers, the physical liquidation of the party leadership, the occupation of the NKVD headquarters, etc. To these accusations were added those of spying for Germany and the setting up of a, quote, fascist military organization within the armed forces, end quote. Footnote, these accusations were formulated especially from the, quote, Bukharin trial, end quote. End footnote. The secret nature of the, quote, trials, end quote, of the military leaders allowed the prosecution to dispense with publishing even the semblance of, quote, proof, end quote. Footnote. What at this time functioned as, quote, elements of proof, end quote, were statements or even allusions made at the various public trials. There was talk also of vague, quote, material proofs, end quote, in the possession of the NKVD. Among these, quote, proofs, end quote, not officially presented was a document fabricated by the Ostabteilung of the German Security Service, which purported to establish that Tukhachevsky was in the service of German espionage. Bracket C.W. Schellenberg, The Schellenberg Memoirs, published in London, 1956, where the, quote, fabricated, end quote, nature of the document is confirmed, in parentheses. The secret Nazi archives seized at the end of the war do not suggest the existence of any plot that could have been prepared in liaison with the German services. At the Nuremberg trial of the Nazi leaders, the Soviet prosecution never raised the question of this alleged, quote, conspiracy, end quote. That's super interesting. End footnote. We shall see in Volume 4 of the present work that the most spectacular trials were the most visible peak of an operation designed to eliminate on a large scale several strata of party, state, and economic cadres. In essence, this operation finished at the end of 1938 because the goal pursued is practically accomplished. Moreover, continuation at the same rhythm of the terror, combined with mass repression, was seriously disorganizing economic and administrative life. Nevertheless, although the intensity of the terror was then reduced, the terror was far from disappearing. Henceforth, the terror was part of the technique of governing. In addition, mass repression continued because the authorities had to make their power felt by those who were liable to resist them, and it was necessary to continue supplying the camps with labor power. New section, Section C. The continuation of mass repression and terror after 1938. In the short account given here of the continuation of mass repression and terror after 1928, it is obviously important to make a distinction between the years 1939 to 41 and the following years. Heading 1, 1939 to 41. In 1939 to 41, mass repression and terror took essentially two forms. Firstly, we have already seen that what hit many workers after putting into effect of labor legislation of an increasingly penal nature. Secondly, there was what developed after the fall of 1939, when repression and terror struck the populations of territories annexed following the signature of the German-Soviet Pact. Footnote: for the German-Soviet Pact, see Volume 4 of this work, and footnote. For example, a short while after the occupation of eastern Poland by Soviet troops, the NKV deported Poles en masse to Siberian camps. Footnote: see A.S. Cardwell, Poland and Russia, published 1944, and Robert Conquest, The Soviet Police System, published in 1968, and footnote. For the different way, I would, if you're interested, check out the pieces that I have on here about the Socialist Workers' Party in the late 1930s and the Workers' Party and the Socialist Workers' Party in the United States in the early 40s, about how they differently interpreted the Eastern, the Russian, the Soviet, I think you could also just say Russian, invasion of Poland in 1939. Anyway, back to the text. For example, a short while after the occupation of eastern Poland by Soviet troops, the NKVD deported Poles en masse to Siberian camps. After the annexation of the Baltic states, deportations of the population also took place on a large scale. It is estimated that 170,000 inhabitants of these states were added to the deportees from Poland, Bukovina, and Bessarabia. Footnote: see the sources in the preceding note and I don't know if it says anonymous, it says anonymous, The Dark Side of the Moon, published in 1946. End footnote. In addition to these mass police operations, there was the individualized terror which struck leading cadres, diplomats, and higher officials who had played an especially active role in the execution of the, quote, anti-fascist, end quote, policy and, quote, collective security, end quote, associated with the League of Nations. Thus, at the end of 1939, the year of the German-Soviet Pact, arrests were made of some of the leaders of the, quote, anti-fascist committees, end quote, operating in Moscow and other large cities. Also arrested were some of the chiefs of the spy network involved in the collection of information in the, quote, Axis countries, end quote, parenthesis, Rome, Berlin, Tokyo, end parenthesis, networks which for a long time remained disorganized. Terror also struck former participants in the Spanish Civil War, while from 1939 the trials that had begun in 1937 to 38 were continued and brought to a, quote, satisfactory conclusion, end quote, resulting in thousands of sentences and executions. Heading 2. Repression and terror during the war and after. The war and the post-war period witnessed a continuation of large-scale repression and terror. These operations reduced the population to silence and kept the camps well populated. The camps thereby received bits and pieces of population which were sent where the authorities thought they were needed. During the war, mass deportations continued. They struck the nationalities: Tartars of the Crimea, Ingushes, Chechens, Volga Germans, etc., were either deported to camps or transferred to regions far distant from their own territory. This repression, in addition, took on real, quote, racist, end quote, character. The, quote, racist nature of the repression, which struck a part of the population involved, among others, the Crimean Tatars, whose descendants are still prohibited from living in their region of origin and are obliged to stay in Uzbekistan, where they were henceforward, quote, free, in parentheses. It also involved the Germans settled for several centuries in Russia, parentheses, the Volga Germans, who had their autonomous republic before the war and settlement in the Ukraine and the North Caucasus, and were almost entirely peasants, end parentheses. During the war, they were all arrested, men, women, and children. As Solzhenitsyn remarks, quote, the criterion which enabled the ... decision to be made as to whom should be arrested was blood, and irrespective of whether one was a hero of the Civil War or an old member of the party, one went into exile, end quote. See Volume 1 of The Gulag Archipelago. See also Robert Conquest's The Soviet Police System, page 49, where different Soviet sources are quoted about the lot of the, quote, nationalities, end quote, mentioned above, as well as several others. See also B. Levitsky, The Uses of Terror. End footnote. At the end of the war, arrests multiplied even in the ranks of the Soviet army. Parentheses, Solzhenitsyn and Kopelev, among many others, are examples of this, end parentheses. Above all, mass repression struck the majority of Soviet citizens who had been made prisoner and deported to Germany or to occupied territories by the German army. These prisoners and deportees left the Nazi camps only to enter Soviet camps. The, quote, allies, end quote, took part in the repression by handing over to the repressive organs of the USSR Soviet prisoners and deportees who had escaped from the German camps. From 1946, new arrests were made when, quote, massive changes of cages, end quote, were made. In certain regions, these affected 50 to 80% of party cages and industrial managers. Footnote. See In Battle, The Last Secret, and see Brûlés, La Partie Bolchevique, and Z. Brzezinski, The Permanent Purge, published in 1956. End footnote. Simultaneously, the purge developed among intellectuals who in large numbers were deprived of their employment, arrested, and deported. Some of the scientists were detained in sharagas, where they continued their research, but others went off to die in the camps. Wikipedia says, the Sharashkas, sometimes Sharaga, sometimes Sharakza, were secret research and development laboratories operating from the 1920s to the 1950s within the Soviet Gulag labor camp system, as well as in other facilities under the supervision of the Soviet Secret Service. Formerly, various secret research and development facilities were called, quote, Special Design Bureau, end quote. Etymologically, the word Sharashka derives from a Russian slang expression, Sharashkina Kontora, Sharashka's office, an ironic derogatory term to denote a poorly organized, impromptu, or bluffing organization, which in its turn comes from the criminal argot term, sharaga, for a band of thieves, hoodlums, etc. The scientists and engineers at Asharashka were prisoners picked by the Soviet government from various camps and prisons and assigned to work on scientific and technological problems. Living conditions were usually much better than in an average taiga camp, mostly because of the absence of hard labor. The result of the research in Sharashkas were usually published, if published at all, under the names of prominent Soviet scientists without credit given to the real researchers whose names frequently have been forgotten. Citation needed . Some of the scientists and engineers imprisoned in the Sharashkas were released during and after World War II, 1939 to 1945, to continue independent careers. Some became world-renowned. End footnote. Not end footnote. Back to the text. During the years 1946 to 1950, there developed the campaign against, quote, bourgeois culture, end quote, and, quote, cosmopolitanism, end quote, which allowed the glorification of the Russian past and the arrest and execution of numerous Jews as, quote, cosmopolitans without country, end quote, end parenthesis. Zhdanov, first secretary in Leningrad, was at the time regarded as one of the initiators of this period of terror. There was talk of Zhdanov's China. In reality, Zhdanov was only a cog in the terror-making machine. Zhdanov died on August 31st, 1948, and the terror intensified. See B. Levitsky's book, Use of Terror, page 185. The struggle against cosmopolitanism continued, but added to it was what was called the, quote, Leningrad Affair, end quote, and then the Moscow Affair. These entailed the sentencing and or execution of those close colleagues of Zhdanov, like Nikolai Voznesensky, a Politburo member, and then in successive waves larger and larger circles of victims, for the ripples from these affairs lasted up till 1952. The two main agents of this repression were Malenkov and Beria. Even before the fallout from the, quote, Leningrad Affair, end quote, had ceased, another, quote, affair, end quote, was being prepared and launched. This was that of the, quote, killer doctors, end quote, accused of having caused the death of Zhdanov and other leaders. This affair, which was also called the, quote, plot of the White Coats, end quote, was entirely staged by the police services under the direct control of the General Secretary. It had several targets. It was accompanied by a, quote, anti-Zionist, end quote, campaign that was in fact anti-Semitic, that was developed on an international scale, and that led from 1951 to the indictment in Soviet bloc countries of many leaders accused of Zionist and other activities. Among them were Reich, Slansky, and others, who later would be rehabilitated, At the same time, the campaign was aimed at the leaders of the security services themselves, who were accused of having, quote, lacked vigilance, end quote, In fact, the accused doctors were freed as innocents in April 1953 by decision of Beria, who was then in charge of security. But some months later, Beria and other security service leaders were executed, and in the list of accusations brought against them, among others, were the same charge that had previously been brought against the, quote, killer doctors, end quote. After the death of Stalin, recourse to this type of individualized terror, which was on a large scale and which developed from a quote, affair, end quote, or, quote, show trial, end quote, became less frequent, and accusations no longer tended to spread to successive and increasingly important circles. Recourse to terror and to fabricated accusations did not disappear, but took other forms. Footnote, to quote but one example, When Beria was condemned, Beria was accused of being a, quote, bourgeois turncoat, end quote, a, quote, agent of imperialism, end quote, and it was even stated that in a, quote, closed trial, end quote, Beria had confessed to having carried on anti-Soviet activities from 1919. Parentheses, see the Soviet press of December 1953, especially Pravda of December 24th, end parentheses. End footnote. Recourse to terror and to fabricate accusations did not disappear but took other forms. In this change can be clearly seen the establishment of new balances between the dominant and exploiting strata and the leading political group, and the effects of ideological changes affecting these strata and this group. In the, quote, Stalin period, end quote, terror was combined fundamentally with mass repression. This combination marked with a particular stamp the relationships of the leading group with all the social strata and classes. It led not only to the very numerous executions, but also allowed regular, quote, supplying, end quote, of the camps with new labor forces. That's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening. And again, the chapter was Chapter 1 of Part 3 of Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, the Third Period, 1930 to 1941, Part 1, The Dominated. The chapter that I read from in this video is from Part 3 of the book, and it was Chapter 1 of Part 3 of the book. Part 3 of the book is titled Mass Terror and Forced Labor. The chapter that I just read was titled Mass Repression and Terror. Thank you so much for listening.